I suppose, huh?
Yeah, that's an understatement. Yeah, very long week.
Yeah. Let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of the Center for Entrepreneurship's mental health programming for the week. Today, I'm really excited to talk about the mental health first aid program. You'll recall that on Monday we talked about mental health in the workplace for business leaders. Tuesday we had a great discussion. Really valued the impact, the input that we had on mental health for employees. Learned a lot, Nick, as I said to you before, the things that I think as a business leader I wish I would have done, but also comforted a little bit by, as a business leader, the things that I realized that we did do. So I guess in doing my own evaluation, there was some give and takes there, I suppose. A quick question that before we get started, I know this is obviously Mental Health Week, and you're doing a lot of programming and talking right now. Just can you let us in a little bit on the week that you've had, some of the talks you've done, some of the events, and also some of the things that you've heard out there?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, Bell Let's Talk Day always seems to be the busiest week or few weeks of the year, so to speak, and it kind of leads into February and extends into February quite a bit as well. So I've been doing a lot of radio stuff. I was on a couple of local Hamilton radio stations this week, one live, a couple recorded. I had a conversation with Madame Prime Minister Sophie Trudeau on, what was that, Wednesday, I guess. So for about 25 minutes, chatted with her on Facebook Live regarding mental health and mental health initiatives. I've done a number of presentations, a few of them with the Canadian Mental Health Association, and then some private corporations generally contract me to come in and do some speaking to their staff and their employees. So I did a few of those this week. And this seems to be the last one for this week. However, I'm sure a bunch more are going to start to pop up for next week and the week after. So I think all in all, this is probably my 15th hour of speaking about mental health in the last 3 days, maybe 17th hour, perhaps, in addition to my classes. So it's been a busy few days, that's for sure.
But apart from that, not much has gone on this week at all, then, Nick. Is that
no, it's been pretty quiet. Yeah, it's quiet. Yeah, very quiet.
How do you find, I was thinking about this last night. How do you find this with your own mental health when you're talking about this during the week? And I know you and I have talked about this in the past, but I'm wondering if you could, talk a little bit to our audience about how you find a week like this for yourself.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's exhausting. Most of my presentations involve vulnerability. So sharing, very emotional parts of my life and stories that I've, some of the secrets that you keep, right? And so most of my presentations involve those kind of secrets and stories. So it is exhausting. It's difficult to, it takes energy, a lot of energy to be vulnerable. It takes a lot more energy to be vulnerable than it does to keep those emotions in. Good energy though, but it's very rewarding. However, and it's funny, for people that like myself and people that work for CMHA, we always talk about this week being, it's supposed to be a week for positive mental health, but for our side of it, it's a week of it, it's draining, it's exhausting in a good way, because there is a lot of reward to it. But it's the week where at the end of the week, it's kind of like your brain is, what's the right word? It's depleted, perhaps is the best way to say it.
Yeah, I do though, and I really value what you're doing for people that might be out there that have been struggling without speaking, and I or they may be struggling openly, and it's just knowing that they're not alone. I think is something very important to everybody. And I've had some comments from some friends who own businesses over the last couple of days who have joined in that they didn't realize sometimes when we talked about mental health for business leaders, they didn't realize, that they were also sick, and they started doing a checklist of some of the things that you and I spoke about, and they said, "Wow, that's me too," and or "Wow, I thought our employee wasn't functioning very well. They didn't care, but maybe they just weren't well." And when they, I've had 2 instances now where they've had conversations with their employees, and they said, "I attended this today. This is what I've seen," and they said, "Yep, you got it. That's been me." And so we know that we've already made a bit of an impact on this, which is really exciting for the center, but something that I'm hoping that we can continue our conversations, Nick, to make sure that you and I both feel the same way about one-off things. We talked about this on Tuesday. They're fantastic, but they need to be programmatic. They need to be something that we do as a culture, not so much a training activity, if you will. So so let's get started today. And this is something that I've been really looking forward to talking about. The mental health first aid program is something that I was introduced to about a year and a half ago, and I read through it. And Nick, I haven't told you this before, but it was sent to me by the CMHA. They said, hey, you should take a look at this as a business leader. And it was that prototypical thing when I get something in my inbox. It was, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. I'm going to get back to it. And then life happened and the business happened, and Monday became Friday, and January became April, and 2018 became 2021 now. And I think that the learning for me is that can't be on the corner of my desk anymore. And that has to be something that we make a priority, because I've always said that there's nothing more important to any business than human capital and having employees that are able to function. You can buy technology, and you can buy new things to decorate your workplace and to make it more productive, but you can't fix people unless you really are more proactive about making sure they're okay. So I'm excited about today. So really, I'm hoping to have a discussion. You obviously are the expert here, but really maybe lead you into some areas that I know our businesses and our employees might really want us to hear more about. So, our discussion topics today really range around 4 different things here. Number 1, Nick, an explanation of the mental health first aid program. Number 2, the areas that are covered by the program, and then 3 and 4, the benefits for the employees and the benefit for the employers, and really talk a little bit about where that might go. So, and then obviously we'll open up to questions and answers. If you've got some questions, please, for the audience, please feel free to pass them in. We've already got a couple now as we begin. So Nick, let's get started if we could. So could you provide us with a quick explanation of the mental health first aid program itself?
Absolutely. So it's, the best way, the quickest way, I think, to summarize it is most people are familiar with physical first aid. So, kind of like triaging a situation, putting essentially survival from a physical injury until you can get somebody to a professional, right? Or until paramedics arrive, or until you can get somebody to a hospital. And the mental health first aid program works the same way. The idea behind it is you create some form of trust or some form of bond between you and a person with the ultimate goal of getting them to professional help. So essentially what you're learning in the course is signs and symptoms of mental health problems, what to look for, what to be on guard for in some ways. And then most importantly, probably the most important part of the program is how to have that conversation with somebody, how to start that conversation, how to initiate it, and how to, what are the right questions? What do I need to ask to understand more? And then how do I get that person to help, right? Because ultimately, like I said, the goal of mental health first aid, similar to basic first aid, physical first aid, is how do we get them, how do we bridge the gap between myself and the person to whether it be a therapist or, a hospital or a paramedic, or, so it's kind of the idea of, you're essentially, we're called mental health first aiders. And essentially what that means, and I don't want to downplay it, but we are kind of like the Band-Aid that keeps somebody alive until we can involve a professional, very much like we would if you pull up on a car accident. How do I keep this person alive until help gets there? It's the same idea. And what we teach in the course is essentially those steps. So mental health first aid is based on 5 actions. So they're not steps, they're 5 actions. So it teaches you how to assess a situation, so assess risk. Then we teach you how to listen, so essentially to listen to the person to get a better understanding, and then how to give some reassurance, encourage or give validation to the problem, and then encourage professional help, and then encourage other help as well, like supports, whether it be exercise or music or a support network at home. So essentially we teach those 5 actions of assess, listen, give reassurance, encourage professional help, and then encourage other help, and how to work through those actions with somebody. And I think what most people find probably the most impactful is that we do a short when I say short, we spend a couple hours on, I don't want to say suicide intervention, but it's kind of like an intervention, how to assess the risk of suicide and what happens if you find out or feel that somebody is at risk of harming themselves or somebody else. And we talk about kind of like that discuss. Well, we role play those discussions to help people understand, that it's okay to ask about suicide. It's okay to talk about suicide. It's okay to ask somebody if they're thinking of suicide or they're thinking of killing themselves or harming somebody else. It's okay to ask those questions, first of all. And second of all, what happens if, or what do you say if somebody says, yes, I am thinking of harming myself? So we go through a lot of those scenarios and we role play them in the class or whatever you want to call it, to help people get a little more comfortable talking about these topics, these difficult things that we consider, that generally have been considered taboo traditionally, that we avoid. Well, we want to start to create that kind of narrative. We want to start to have those conversations, to educate people, first of all, and second of all, to make people understand that suicide is, for example, is not something we should be avoiding. It's something we should be talking more about.
Are you seeing that community groups are participating in this program? Are you seeing that more businesses are participating in this program? Can you talk to us a little bit more about who you are seeing in your classes?
Yeah, honestly, it's a variety of everybody. And if you offer them, when I've offered them to community members, you see a lot of people come in with the intent of understanding to utilize it at their job or at their work. I've also been hired by corporations to come in and run these courses for their staff. And they're obviously volunteer. They don't force their staff to do them. But they come in with the intent of helping not only people in the workplace, but themselves for that matter, and to take these skills and transfer them to their lives, because these skills are transferable everywhere, right? It's, one of the big components that we teach is communication, how to effectively communicate and how to effectively ask questions and how to effectively listen without giving solutions, right? And which is a common problem we see, is that people listen to reply, not to understand. So we talk a lot about general communication skills that you don't learn in high school or college or university, or in life for that matter, until somebody forces you to. So it's a good mix. And I think we need to recognize that, yes, it's going to be very beneficial in a business, obviously. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that any business can benefit from their employees and managers and owners and having this training. But it's skills that transfer throughout life. It's not just mental health related. It's not just if your friend is sick or has a mental health problem. It's communication skills that you can utilize with everybody, in your relationships, and whether it be friends or family or spouse. These are skills that are transferable to all aspects of life.
It's interesting. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, if this was something that as a business leader, I'd want to incorporate into my business, I'd want to do a lot of thinking on who is the best person to take this course as well. And, I know in the past when you've got committees like your first aid and your CPR and your health and safety, you go around and you're sort of begging, groveling to make sure that someone's okay to go and do these things. My thought, though, and I'm interested in what you think about this, is that as a business leader, I'd want to be selective and really careful on who I pick for this, to make sure this is someone who is a listener, someone who can be trusted among their employees. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no, because the one thing we do experience a lot of are people that are in the course probably for the right reasons, but we learn quickly and they learn quickly that the information, the skills that they're learning are not appropriate for them to be the ones that are administering, right? So the one thing that we do say is because it's so education based, our goal is to obviously break down any stigma. So at the very least, we're starting to reduce the stigma. And as a mental health first aid instructor, one of our roles, one of our jobs is to ensure that all participants are capable of not only learning the information, but administering the skill. And if somebody in our class, in a mental health first aid class, if we determine are not the right people to be learning and administering these skills, we actually, part of our job is to remove them from the class, obviously respectfully, because it's our job to make sure that if you're going to be administering some of these, a suicide intervention, for example, we don't want just anybody to learn that skill. And if you're somebody that still has this traditional stigma that's, and it's coming out in how you interact with us, well, my job is to make sure that you're not learning these skills and then trying to administer or use them on people and then possibly causing a negative outcome. So that as a mental health first aid instructor, that's my job. I wouldn't be too worried about it as a boss or a manager or a business owner or anything like that, because ultimately, at the very least, what it does give you feedback as a business owner or a manager is that interaction between myself as the instructor and you is going to I'll be able to tell you, well, I'd be cautious of this person and how they interact with your staff. And, that's kind of like another layer, possibly is the right way to say it, another layer to the training, because now as the instructor, I can see who is the appropriate people that are going to be the ones that you want, involved in maybe a mental health committee or whatever, whatever your business has. And then those that maybe are best left, they're great workers, they're great employees, but they're probably not the best support person in these roles. And oftentimes when they are voluntary, like for example, if I go into a business, most of the time enrollment is voluntary. So when it's voluntary, you're going to get the ones that want to be there anyways. The ones that sign up are there for the right reasons. They're not there just to fill time and because it's 2 days of, not doing your job type thing. They're there for the right reasons.
It's a great point. And I think that itself helps the stigma, doesn't it? And it helps the stigma to have people in that room that you mentioned voluntary, which I find very interesting because, there's often in the workplace, a lot of these CPR and first aid and some of the mandatory training is not voluntary. And so you've got people in there because they have to be, not because they want to be. And I think that in a course like this, you help break a stigma down by people that really are passionate about helping their coworkers and helping their peers. And so I find that very interesting. Let's move on to our second topic, Nick, if we can. I'm interested in knowing the areas and topics that are covered by the program. What's the scope? Where, what do you talk about? What types of subjects do you really want to make sure that you help the group out with?
So essentially, it's broken down into sections, and it's broken down into sections or chapters, so to speak. So the very first chapter is obviously an introduction into mental health. What is mental health? What is mental illness? Talking about, where mental illness comes from and just basic like risk factors and things like that, and trying so people have an understanding around what mental health actually is. And then we get into mood disorders. Specifically, we spend a lot of time on depression, because depression being one of the most common mental health problems in the world. The next section is anxiety-based anxiety disorders, and we spend a lot of time talking about general anxiety because obviously that being one of the biggest, most common mental health problems as well. And then we talk about psychosis or psychotic disorders is the final section. And in that section, it's really designed to help people understand what psychosis is, what schizophrenia is, because there's so many myths around mental illness and people misunderstanding what it actually is. So generally with those categories, we talk about what it is, what are the signs and symptoms, what are the things that might, the things that people might do or not do with those different illnesses or different conditions. And then we talk about risk factors for each of them. And then we get in more into activity-based stuff of, okay, well, the what ifs, right? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if you recognize, somebody has been struggling, and so essentially, what are you looking for as a bystander, as a community member? What am I looking for in my friends or in my colleagues? What are the things that I might recognize? And then what do I do about it? What's my next step? So engaging in that conversation, and then knowing what resources to provide. So very much, the goal, and as a professor as well, my goal with my students and in mental health first aid is I want to teach you more than the average person knows, so you understand it at a level higher than most people. Because if you can understand it at a higher level than most people, then you're going to be able to apply it at the level you need to. So the goal is to help kind of ultimately it's knowledge based. And then with that, all of that knowledge, how do you apply the information? How do you help somebody get the help they need?
It's interesting. You know, these are all great points, but I picked up on one thing that I'd love to ask you about, and that is really when you talk about some of the myth versus reality on these things. And you know, I know from my own desire to learn more about anxiety and stress and the relations between your gut health and your head health and different things. A lot of it is myth and a lot of it's reality, and there's a lot there. I would imagine that you do spend a lot of time talking about myth and talking about sort of breaking down some of those things. Would that be correct to assume?
Yeah, definitely, because the course is very, it's designed to be interactive. And one of the first things I say when I start the course is how much you enjoy this is dependent on you. Because if you're not engaged, if you're not asking questions, if you're not participating in the activities, then this is going to be really dry. But it's designed to be interactive, to be question, discussion based, you know, the what ifs, right? So it's all about, well, I've had this experience. What do I do about it? Or, you know, I've heard about this. Is that true? Or so it's very much driven by the participants. And then the instructors are designed, are obviously educated and trained to kind of be the mediator in that discussion. And oftentimes in a mental health first aid course, it becomes a lot about sharing, right? Sharing, you know, well, my family member has this, or, you know, in my family, this happened, or I know somebody who died by suicide, or, you know, so then it becomes a lot, I don't want to say it becomes a discussion around empathy, you know, and that's one of the big take home skills is you start to realize that mental illness is not this thing that we're just trying to bring awareness to. It's all around us, right? We're surrounded by it. And if you have a room of 25 people in a mental health first aid class, all of them know somebody or have experienced some form of mental illness that has directly impacted them in some way. And at least half of them bring that up through the course. So then it becomes a discussion of, you know, it's almost like the participants are educating each other and breaking down some of those myths as well, which is my favorite part of the course. You know, my job as a facilitator is literally to get you, the participant, as engaged as possible. And then I just sit back and make sure that nobody is obviously insulting anybody, or it's, you know, it's not getting to a point where it's argumentative, where the discussion is respectful. And you know, as the instructor or the facilitator, again, my job is just to make sure that nobody's spreading false information, essentially. And when it always happens that there is false information being spread. So my job is to engage that discussion and say, well, actually, here's the fact versus the myth, and kind of get into more of a discussion of why that might be a myth and why there's, you know, it's very science-based. It's honestly, the whole course is science-based.
It's interesting, you know, myths and beliefs, and you know, we live in a generation where we can find out a right or a wrong answer within 6 or 7 seconds by going online. And I had an interesting conversation with a fellow business leader yesterday, and you know, she was saying that one of the hardest things for her was understanding how much mental illness impacts her. And you know, she says it's not like breaking an ankle or breaking an arm where you can look at it, you can see it, you know, that in 6 weeks you get a cast off and you'll do physio and this and that. There's so many different triggers to it, and so many different physiological and physical and mental things that you've got, whether it's your chest or your headaches or different things. And she was saying that's the hardest thing to break down, is actually the awareness of those things. And she said the biggest thing she's learned through her own battles is exactly that, is that those things are natural and those things are okay. And that stigma itself, and breaking that down and knowing that those are the things that you're going to feel if you're going through some battles with mental health, that's okay. And it's not something new. It's not something, you know, that's something that's emerging. It's just what you deal with. And that's, you know, and I really love the example she gave yesterday about, you know, breaking an arm and breaking an ankle and knowing you've got a cast so you can look at it and see it. But having that understanding, whereas you don't have the understanding sometimes with some of your mental health challenges too. So it was interesting. I'm interested if you can help us out, Nick, with a little bit with the actual logistics of the course. How long is the course? Is it over a number of days? How many hours? Could you give us more information on that?
Definitely. So the face-to-face program is designed to be a 12-hour course. So it extends over 2 days. So it's designed, so I'm going to talk about best practice. There's obviously alternatives. Best practice is to run it 2 days back to back. That's what best practice is, because the first day really sets up the second day, and people always come back on the second day with a lot more questions, a lot more energy, knowing what to expect. In addition to, they always relate it back to the first day, because on the first day, a lot of people it starts off quiet, like any class, right? There's minimal engagement to start because people aren't overly comfortable, getting into it. And then the second day is far more activity based. So it's broken into those 4 sections that I mentioned. So you kind of have your introduction, you get into mood disorders, and then suicide prevention intervention. And then day 2 is anxiety disorders and psychosis. So it's basically morning, afternoon, and then there are breaks and lunch built in. So with the course, you get a manual, which is basically a textbook, and we essentially cover the important pieces of that manual. But the manual is obviously the participants to keep, because it has so much additional information, so many additional resources, that we literally just scrape the surface of the manual. There's also, so they recently, in light of the pandemic, the Mental Health Commission of Canada just released a virtual mental health first aid, which is actually all done virtually. It's not the same as the mental health first aid basic course that I'm talking about, but the objectives are the same. So with the virtual course, there's an online module that you have to complete first, which is basically like a 2-hour self-directed module. And then you have 2 3-hour blocks of virtual delivery. And not all instructors are certified to deliver the virtual mental health first aid. For example, I didn't take the training, only for no other reason other than time, A, and B, for me, I personally value that face-to-face instruction. I think the virtual misses a lot of the key conversation points and misses a lot of the key communication lessons that we're trying to learn that you wouldn't necessarily get, like, for example, talking to Ryan, all I can really see is your face. I can't see your body language. I can't see if you're fidgeting or shifting or your level of comfort with the things that I'm saying. Whereas in that actual face-to-face environment, I can get a feel for how everybody is whether, and you mentioned triggers, whether somebody's triggered, whether somebody, is comfortable with the conversation, whether they're actually going to be the right type of person to deliver the material. So I can get a better idea in that face-to-face program. And I honestly feel, again, and this is as a mental health first aid instructor, this is not meant to be critical of the virtual version. I just feel that we should deliver the material face-to-face. That being said, the virtual version, Jill, who, as Ryan knows, is a colleague in the CMHA employee, she delivers the virtual version. And feedback from her is that it's valuable. It's just different than the basic mental health first aid, which I offer. It's valuable, but it's different. So she would actually, and many instructors would recommend, if you were going to do one, I would suggest doing the face-to-face. But there's value in doing both as well. I mean, obviously that's a factor of time in addition to, how much you want to give to the program, I guess you could say.
And I guess during these times, it's really our best and only option as well, isn't it? And I would probably say, instead of, maybe the best thing to do is to do both and to have the virtual side right now while we can, and then follow it up later on with the physical, because as you and I agree, doing carpet bomb training and doing one-offs it's just not enough for things that are that important to our employees. So thanks for that, Nick. Yep. Sorry,
in addition to, no, that's okay. So in addition, I mean, up until the stay-at-home order, we were still allowed to deliver mental health first aid, as long as we were meeting, obviously, the public health guidelines of how many people in a space and per space and things like that. So up until the stay-at-home order, we were still delivering in-person mental health first aid. It was the stay-at-home order that really kind of drove the virtual as well, because now we're obviously not allowed to do anything face-to-face. Although first aid, so basic CPR and first aid, is still considered essential. Mental health first aid has not been deemed essential yet, but I would assume that it's probably on its way to be deemed essential. So we're probably still a ways away from it, but I'm assuming that we'll be able to offer it face to face, regardless of what zone of lockdown we might be in, given what city you're in, type thing.
Nick, it's interesting when you mention the differences between how we treat physical first aid, if you will, and mental health first aid. We've actually got 2 questions already that have been submitted to us since our talk about that. So I'll sort of table that for the end of our session, but there is some interest in knowing, why it's seen to be different and why it's challenged different. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. If we can move on to our third section here, I'm interested in your thoughts on the benefits of the program for employees. What have you seen? What's the impact been within the workplace?
So it creates an environment of, this is one of those things, and I think Jill mentioned this the other day. This is one of those things that businesses should be doing to create that inclusive environment where you're making your employees, your colleagues, comfortable having these honest and real discussions, right? And ultimately, we're looking at employees, colleagues, we're employers, managers. We're looking at this as people. We're people, right? So at the end of the day, obviously in a business, the bottom line is what keeps the business open. But at the end of the day, we're all people. And whether you're a good employee or a bad employee, I want you alive more than anything. I want you healthy more than anything, because that's all that really matters. Maybe you're not the right person for my business, but at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that I don't care for your health, right? So the one thing that I always like to stress is the benefit is that you're making sure people are healthy, and you're creating an environment where it's okay to not be okay, first of all, and it's okay to admit that. It's okay to admit you're having a bad day. It's okay to admit that, I've been having a really difficult time with whatever's going on, or, I lost somebody in my family and it's causing me a lot of stress. It's taking a lot of my brain power away, so having those kind of real conversations is ultimately what we're trying to create. And I think when your employees are trained in this, you create that kind of connection, that community within your employees. If you've all, for example, if you have a company that has 25 employees and they've all taken mental health first aid, you have a community of mental health first aid trained people where I know that, Ryan's trained in mental health first aid. And I know that if I'm having a bad day, I can go and talk to Ryan because Ryan is trained in the same thing I am, right? He knows that it's okay to have a bad day. And if I am having a bad day, that he would expect me to come to him. So it creates that kind of community of acceptance. I don't know if that's the right word, acceptance, inclusion. It creates that community of trust. It creates that community of just kind of being reliant on each other in some ways. So when more people are trained, and I've gone into some pretty large companies and done this as well, year after year, the more people that are trained, the feedback is constantly, we're creating this better workplace because people are ultimately happier because they know that it's okay to have good days and bad days, and they're not coming in dreading coming to work because their anxiety is high or because they're overwhelmed with something, or maybe they're diagnosed with something. So they're not dreading coming to work because they know that their colleagues are trained in understanding what mental illness is, which is ultimately what we're trying to do, is just educate people. The more people that are educated, the greater the I don't want to say productivity because I don't want to use business related terms, but the greater the buy-in to what you're actually doing, right? The greater the connection to the job, right? And by creating that inclusiveness and that kind of that community, you're getting more buy-in. You're going to get, employees are going to be more understanding of each other. And when they're more understanding of each other, they dread going to work less.
It's interesting, when you mention buy-in and productivity, and I guess from my standpoint, we think that way as business leaders. Jill and I had a conversation when we had our last session on Tuesday about the concept of presenteeism, and it's something that as a business person I've always thought of is I need to make sure that our employees are motivated enough to do the best job that they can, and they're not coming to work because they have to go to work. And I've thought a lot the last couple of days, Nick, about presenteeism and the relationship to mental health, about the fact that we could get better at making a more open and inclusive environment for our workers, then presenteeism would go up, and then business people like myself would feel comfortable with productivity, and then all of a sudden it becomes an investment in my people, not so much a cost. And that's any training becomes that way unless you see the impact. And I think that's potentially one of the biggest hurdles from my side in doing it mental health first aid is will I see the impact, and will I see the investment? Will I see it come in there? And I think presenteeism is an area that we could point to when it comes to the impact. I also think, from having conversations with business leaders this week, that just creating that open environment in this is something that it can be so beneficial for our employees, is to know that you've got an environment where we respect each other, and we have an open environment where we're able to talk as much as we can. We'll never get 100% with people being open, but at least sort of take that lid off of issues that may be present that, again, many employees know about among each other, many business leaders don't. And that's something that I think is very present for us as well. So we'll move on to the next one then, Nick, if we could. So can we talk a little bit about the benefit for business leaders and employers?
Absolutely. And I think you almost answered the question yourself there. Is if you can create it as treat it as an investment, then you're going to get a return on it, right? There's no doubt in my mind that having, your employees trained in this is going to create an investment, a return for the employers. Now, I think I said something in the last session as well. I think it has to start at the top. I really do. And I think that's the hardest part to get across to business leaders, is that it starts with you. It starts with you not only committing to this, but being educated in it. Because if you can, just like any, captain or coach of any team, if the coach isn't going to do it, the players aren't going to do it, right? If the coach isn't, hasn't bought in, the players aren't going to buy in. So the passion has to come from the top, right? The passion and the purpose. So knowing that, for example, if I worked for a company, knowing that my manager, my direct manager was trained in it, it would more likely make me want to be trained in it if it ever got brought up, right? Because if it's important to them, it's important to me. And that's part of the buy-in as well. And as an employer, if you're not buying into it, again, why is the employee going to buy into it? And the benefit ultimately is, honestly, I can speak from my own experience. Walking into my boss's office and telling them that I need to take some time off because of my mental health, or basically just expressing that. I remember walking into my boss's office and saying, I'm not well, and I don't know when I'm going to feel well again. And being able to say that to my boss in the moment, obviously was a very emotional experience, but knowing I could go in and say that was probably one of the, I don't know how to word it, one of the most important experiences in my workplace that I've ever had, because I felt comfortable going in and saying that, knowing that in this case, she was going to say, how can I help? Let's figure this out. What do you need? Do you need time off? Do you need this? Do you need that? Do you need me to reduce your course load? What do you need? And it was having that open conversation with my boss, not only created a new level of respect for her that I had for her, it created I don't want to say a friendship, because that's not ultimately what it was, but it created that bond where I knew that she had my back, right? That it wasn't about my job at that point. It was about me. And that's because she was, I don't want to say educated in mental health or mental health first aid or anything like that, but she made it clear that my health or her employees' health was priority one. And it didn't matter if you need time off for this, or if you need time off for that, or you need a reduced, load because of this. It wasn't about, the budget. It was about, are you okay? And that was something that I'll never forget. And for any employer, I can tell you that the value of that for me as the employee is immeasurable. It's truly immeasurable. It made me want to be more, I don't want to say productive, but more productive. It made me want to do more for, in this case, the program. It made me want to be a better employee, because my boss ultimately said, I've got your back, and whatever it takes, however long it takes, I don't care. I've got your back, and we're going to, we'll figure it out. And it wasn't about money. It wasn't about budget. It wasn't about productivity. It was truly about somebody caring for another person. So as the employer, I think that's the benefit. I think the benefit is you have employees that know they can walk into your office and say, I'm not well, and not worry about what you're going to say. Well, how much work have you done? When are you going to get this project done? It wasn't about that. It was about, all right, well, let's figure out what we need to do to get you healthy. Because the bottom line is, obviously your business doesn't exist without your employees, right? So if your employees are, I don't want to say mistreated, but if your employees aren't well and they think they can't come to you, then ultimately your business is going to be less successful. Whatever, no matter what the business is, it's going to be less successful if your employees aren't well.
It's interesting in having conversations this week, and a colleague of mine went and said, well, I just, for when his employees can come back to work, they're going to come back to new chairs and new laptops and a new air filtration system. And he says, I spent a lot of money on having my employees be able to come back to a much better physical workplace. He says, now I have to think about, or now I want to think rather about, what can I do on the mental side too to make it better. And it was an interesting conversation, because we both agreed that we never had thought that way before. That, when you do employee surveys and they say things, you start to, training is, you look for quick hits. You look for things that we can fix right away to show that you're listening. And he says it's amazing how when we do employee surveys, we've asked nothing about mental health and nothing what we can do about what can we do to have people be better. Something also came to mind, Nick, as you were mentioning, a lot of employees have anxiety themselves about how they talk to their boss, and can they be open with their boss without repercussions. And I think as a business leader, that might be something that this course could help us so much with, couldn't it be? In how to have those conversations, whether they be performance conversations or performance about not being well. Because that initial conversation you have is often how you think the workplace is going to react to your issues as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, I've had many bosses over the years, and I've also had many bosses that I couldn't have that honest conversation with. And one specific example, I did have that honest conversation with, and I was reprimanded for it. I was punished for it, for being open and honest about something. So that environment it's toxic. And I can tell you from my experience, that made me not want to work for that person anymore. And ultimately it slowed my production, right? I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to do it anymore. All because I was open and honest about something I believed in. Now I'm being punished for it. Well, you know what? I'm not going to do what I would normally do for you in that case. I'll do my job enough to get by, but I'm not going to do what I could do for you.
It's interesting. We go back to the stat that I had given on Tuesday that, studies will say that around 80% of people will leave their jobs because of their boss and because of their direct manager. And if those 80% of people have negative conversations about some of the things they're dealing with, I mean, to me, they've got one foot out the door, don't they? Because either it's a presenteeism issue, it's an absenteeism issue, or it's a retention issue, because they start to look for somewhere where they might be better received. And so I think that's a very important point for business leaders too, is to understand that this is something that can help their business, because your best employees are well. And that's something that we have to listen to. It really is. So I'd like to, Nick, I've got a couple questions. We'll move to the question and answer stage now. I've got a couple that I'll ask one, and I think the second one, it would be a great discussion piece for you and I to have as well. So the very first question really is, who is best to take this program? Who is best within a community group or the workplace to take this program? I think that goes back to our original discussion on, is it someone that's a better listener? Is it someone that's been there longer? Can you give us a little bit of insight on who you've seen to be the most impactful and successful people within this program?
It's the ones you would least expect, to be honest. It's the people that you would least expect to be, I don't know if successful is the right word, but to be the most engaged, to take the most home with them, perhaps. It's the people that you wouldn't expect to be engaged are engaged. And ultimately what it does is it creates an environment where people can have a voice, where your voice, it doesn't matter, there's no judgment in the room ever. And that's one of the keys that we establish right away. One of the variables that is established minute one, hour one, is if you're going to be judgmental, then this course is not a place for you. This environment is not the place for you to be. You feel free to walk out at any point. Type of conversation. But I ultimately, and I think I've said this a couple of times today. I ultimately think it starts with the managers. It starts with the people that are leading to be in it first, because ultimately, if you're a manager, assuming you have that I'm making the assumption as a manager, you have some leadership quality, and with that leadership quality or leadership, those characteristics of a good leader, a good captain, your employees are going to want to follow that. your employees are going to want to follow your footsteps. And if you create that environment among your team, if I have a team of, under me of 5 employees or 5 colleagues, I don't even like saying under me, but if I'm responsible for 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 people, if I'm the leader and trained in mental health first aid, then my team is going to feel, they're going to feel that community, right? And they're going to want to be trained in it. They're going to know that this is an environment where, yes, I can make a mistake, but it's going to allow me to thrive as well. And I think that's a big part of the conversation that maybe we haven't really touched on is, it's creating an environment where it's okay to be wrong. It's creating an environment where it's okay to make a mistake and you're not going to get fired for it, right? That type of conversation. It's okay to call in sick because you can't stop crying, right? I mean, those are the types of real conversations that I think start from the top, and the direction has to come from the top.
It's interesting. I'll make 2 quick points, Nick. I have a colleague who's a business leader, and he prides himself on the fact he hasn't taken a sick day in 22 years. And when employees would often not be well, sometimes he'd go and say, well, look, I've never taken a sick day and I'm never sick. And why are you? And I remember sometimes listening to that thinking, times have changed in many ways. And especially with COVID, we're going to encourage people not to come to work. But being sick sometimes doesn't mean that you've got the flu. And being sick sometimes means I call in because I say I've got the flu, but really I've been up all night with anxiety or stress or whatever it might be. And I think that's something that we as a business and a leader generation have to get better at too, is understanding that it's okay to not be here. And that's not a performance issue. It could be, but it's not often a performance issue. It's something you have to understand. And the other interesting thing that you brought up about management, I think business leaders have a responsibility overall to pick the best leaders and the best managers. And this is something that I sometimes, when I teach leadership, I say, it's like deputy leadership. I've been here long enough so I get the star on my chest and I keep going. And we assume that because they're the longest tenure, we assume that because they're the ones that might be the best at a job, they'll be the best managers or leaders. And I think that's where, as business leaders, we really err as well, overall, not just in mental health, but I think sometimes we make some bad decisions that way too. So a question that I'd like to ask that's come in, I think is a great one too, is, how does one actually become a mental health instructor?
So it's a process. I mean, you have to be sponsored by somebody. So whether it be your business or for example, Mohawk College sponsored me to be an instructor. So they basically wrote a proposal to the Mental Health Commission of Canada. What's the right word? Stating, supporting, giving me a reference that I would be a good mental health first aid instructor. So essentially you have to be sponsored by a business or someone or something to become an instructor. But that doesn't certify that you're going to be an instructor. You then go through an application process. They do a little bit of a vetting process to see what your background is, who you are, whether you're, essentially whether you'd be a good advocate for mental health, obviously. And then once you're approved, you go through a week-long training. So you go to a week-long course and there's very few of them offered. You go through a week-long training of becoming an instructor, and not everybody makes it through the training. So when I was in my instructor training, there were 15 of us in the instructor training, and I think only 9 were certified instructors at the end. 6 were not successful, and they were told that they had to basically come back and try again. So just getting there doesn't mean you're certified. In addition to that, you have to maintain your instructor status by running a certain number of courses every year, which is generally 3 per 12-month cycle. And you have to be an instructor in good standing. So at the end of every course, the participants provide feedback on you as the instructor, both in person, and then they receive a survey after the course. And some instructors aren't able to maintain their status due to negative feedback. So instructors are generally, they're vetted. There's a screening process, and they make sure only the ones that are appropriate get through. In addition to that, I think when I was trained in 2014, I think. So actually, I think it was closer to 7 years ago now. And when I was trained, it was quite expensive to go through the training because obviously they have to have an instructor there. I did my training in London, Ontario, but oftentimes you have to travel to do your training in other cities, and so it's quite a process.
I have put up the links there. I'm going to assume, Nick, that more information can be found on the CMHA website. Is that correct?
Definitely. The Mental Health First Aid website so if you click on that, it's also going to give you options of, do you want to become an instructor? And it talks about that process. There's also, with Mental Health First Aid, they've actually broken it down into different, different specialties. So for example, there's a Mental Health First Aid for children, which is basically focusing on mental health in children. There's Mental Health First Aid for Indigenous populations. So there's one specific to Indigenous people. There's one specific to older adults, so seniors. So essentially they've broken it into categories. The one that I'm an instructor for is basic mental health first aid, which is essentially applicable to everybody, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And doing my own research for that, I was really impressed by the scope and the wide range. And it's interesting in my own learning that, a lot of mental health issues are generic, but also a lot are specific to certain demographics as well. So it was great to see that's been identified too. So a last question for me, Nick, and it's one that I've been waiting to ask now for 3 sessions. That's come to us now. Actually, we've got 4 people who have asked a question, and we'll make it 5 for me. As a business owner, we as a business leader, rather, we have health and safety committees. We've got first aid. We send people away to CPR training. The question that's come in here is, why are we behind? Why are we behind when it comes to mental health first aid? Why is it that this has not been a priority? Why is it that, when you talk about regulations and legislation, we've got these, and as a business leader, I've got more manuals. We've killed more trees telling us some of the things that we have to do, whether it be, in a collision industry, whether it be in an HVAC industry. We've got all these regulations that we've got, and anything that we're going to teach. Why is it that we're behind when it comes to mental health first aid and mental health teaching and mental health understanding? And why can't it be the same as a first aid course, a CPR course?
It's an incredible question, and it's a question that I think comes up almost every time I do a presentation: is why are we behind? Why aren't we? Why isn't it treated? Mental illness treated the same as physical illness or any disease for that matter. My answer is always, we're getting there. We are getting there. It's truly getting better every day. In fact, on the radio the other day, I was asked the question, do I think stigma is being reduced? Like, is it going down? And it is. It 100% is, because Ryan, you can probably attest to this, 10, 15 years ago, or even maybe 2-3 years ago, you're not going to be sharing stories about anxiety with people. You're not going to be talking about mental health with people. It's getting better because people are starting to become more educated. When I was in school, university, high school, there were no seminars on mental health, and God forbid you ever admit that you're having a bad day to anybody, because then you're ridiculed for having a bad day. So it's getting better. I don't know what it's going to take to get to a point where it's on the same level. And in fact, I don't know if it will ever get to the same level as physical illness, because unfortunately, until there's a complete turnover in generation, where I think our younger generation now, specifically our young teenagers, our young teens, are at a point where they're comfortable sharing. So until they become the leaders of the world, I don't think we will be seeing that kind of equality between physical illness and mental illness. We'll get close, but I don't think we'll get there. But I still think there's always going to be a little bit of stigma. There's always going to be some stigma that holds back the conversation, that kind of controls the narrative just a little bit. And that's going to come, again, from the top down. But we're getting better. We're getting better. And I think the media is doing a great job of it as well. And there's good and bad of everything. But the media has come a long way with recognizing that mental health is important. And you see it with, newspapers and news stations and radio stations. They're talking about it because it's real, right? It may not be tangible. You can't feel it, right? You can't put your hands on it, like you said, a cast, right?
Mhm.
It's like you can't go sign somebody's head, but it's there, right? So it's becoming, it's at the forefront. I think it's just a matter of time.
And I think perhaps, that would be the usefulness of a week like this in an event like Bell Let's Talk, because we do get, you do have the media attention. It's imperative on business leaders, it's imperative on community leaders, in my opinion, to make sure that continues, and that we do what we can. But it's something that, all week I've been wondering this for a while now, but all week I've been asked about that question is why is it that there's so much more work paid towards things? Potentially, maybe it's because it's legislative, Nick. Maybe because we do have regulatory needs to go and conduct these things. Maybe that's the biggest route. But it's a question that has been pervading all week right now as I've been talking about these sessions. So thanks for that. So folks, that really wraps up our Mental Health Week programming on behalf of the Center for Entrepreneurship. Nick, I want to extend a very sincere thank you to you. Not so much, not just for the conversations that we've had, but also in what you've given to our group and our community right now, for the center as well as our Mohawk College community, and obviously the work that you've been doing, by and large all over the place this week. I do invite everyone to check out the Canadian Mental Health Association website as well as their first aid program. I'm including Nick's contact information here. Nick, I didn't ask you to do that. I hope that was okay. And what we'll do is we'll put this presentation today on our YouTube channel. For anyone that's not live, I know we've got a lot of requests on behalf of community groups and companies to send this to them. And this will also include the links that we've got right there. Thank you very much, everyone, for their time, for your time. We appreciate it. We hope this helps, most importantly, and we'll be in touch and talk soon. Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you.